Greetings, friends. London Gruski Desu, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian war update for the week of December 4th through 10th of 2023. And this week we have a lot of updates, and I mean a lot. The Russians are on the attack throughout the entire front, and there's been a lot of big changes. And let's get straight into it because there's a lot to talk about. And this week we're actually going to be starting in Bakhmut because that's actually where a lot of the most interesting updates are coming from, surprisingly. So, the Russians are. This is where. So, as we know, in the summer, the Ukrainians were on the offensive here. The purpose of the Ukrainian attack was to try to encircle Bakhmut and take it back. But obviously, they didn't make much progress. Here, they took a few fields. Here, they took Klishchiivka and Andriivka. But besides that, after about 4 months, 5 months of fighting, they weren't able to advance much beyond those things. And now the Russians are on the attack, and in a lot of places they basically recaptured what they lost. Let us begin in the southern part. So first, one of the biggest surprises was the Russians launched a full-on assault on the major strategic strong point in this area, the Hill 219, I believe. It's this is what they call the strong point in this area. You can actually see this on the map here. You can see a lot of the trenches and stuff here. Now, the purpose of this is that the reason why there's this big fortification in this area is because this is a hill, and this hill basically is is like the dominant height in this southern area of Bakhmut, this Bakhmut flank. And if the Russians were able to take this hill, they'd be able to basically defend Klishchiivka. That is actually why when the Russians lost this defense node, when the Ukrainians attacked, it was only a matter of time before they lost Klishchiivka and Andriivka. So the Russians launched an attack from the north here and managed to capture basically this entire entire strong point. There was still some clearing to do. There was still some solidifying to do. But they managed to occupy, I think, almost 100% of the strong point. What does this mean for the Ukrainians in this position if the Russians are able to hold the strategic Hill 219? I think that's the name of it. But so what does it mean if the Ukrainians manage to hold it, or the Russians? Well, that means that the Ukrainian positions in Klishchiivka itself are basically untenable. The Russians are behind them, and not only are they behind them, they are on a hill. And the Russians, the Ukrainians are now in the sack, and the Ukrainians will have to basically force themselves to withdraw back to the canal, which is where they could have a better defense point. They're out of the pocket here, and this is also more on higher ground than this bottom area. So Chasiv Yar is the dominant height in this area, and so the Ukrainians have an advantage here. But in this localized area, this is the major height, and so the Ukrainian positions trying to fight, along this rail line and in Klishchiivka itself are under threat. So that means Klishchiivka will fall, and if Klishchiivka falls, then the Ukrainian grouping in Andriivka basically falls immediately, because then the Russians will be right here, and the Ukrainian positions here will be, very untenable. And so if the Russians manage to hold this, which they captured this week, what I expect is basically they will, the new front line will be along the Donbass Sovietsky Donetsk Canal here. And basically these two villages will return under Russian control, and I expect this to happen over the next maybe month or so. So maybe by the end of the year, maybe. That's probably the goal, to try to basically once that happens, and the Russians have this local strong point here, as you can see with the trenches, the Ukrainians will not be able to conduct attacks to try to take it back, because it's very hard to do so. They'll have to retreat and begin their defenses of Ivanivska here, which is the main focal point. So this is the center of Ukrainian Bakhmut operations. This is the center, technically Chasiv Yar, but this is kind of like the more forward position where they've been sending troops to defend the northern part of Bakhmut, the southern part of Bakhmut, and the Russians need to capture this so that the Ukrainian position on the eastern part of the Sovietsky Donetsk Donbass Canal is compromised, and they fall back to defending Chasiv Yar. And along with this, the Russians are on the attack on these dachas here. The Russians managed to capture these dachas here. I think there's still fighting going on over these specific dachas here. But so the Russians are on the attack from the Bakhmut to the west, trying to get right up to Ivanivska from the eastern part. They're hoping to clear out once collapse the Ukrainian defenses in Klishchiivka and Andriivka, so they could begin assault operations to the south of Ivanivska. So having it on two sides, and then also we're going to talk about this in a moment. In the north, they are trying to basically further operations where they're able to get to the north of Ivanivska. And basically, the whole purpose of this operation in Bakhmut is basically reaching the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal. You might be wondering why. Not only will the Russians be in a very good defensive position here, it would also allow them to begin assault operations on Chasiv Yar by starting to attack it on the sides. This might take a little bit more because, Ukrainians are on the hill here, on the dominant height or on higher ground in Chasiv Yar. So I think this operation is more localized. I think they're just trying to take everything to the east of the canal. I don't think they're trying to take Chasiv Yar. I think this is a localized operation. It's a big gain in terms of the advances of, a lot of time we talk about they took a tree line after 3 weeks of fighting, or it's just a little back and forth, some skirmishes. And so taking these 5 or 6 villages, might not see, in the grand scheme of things, that's not a lot, but in terms of, as I mentioned, this war is based on tactical advancements to improve your tactical positions, and this helps Russia gain their tactical initiative here and get better tactical defenses. So that's happening in the south. Let's talk about the north, because this is actually where a lot of the more interesting areas are happening in Bakhmut. The Russians managed to capture what they call the forest nursery. This was a strong point of the Ukrainians here. So the Russians managed to attack and capture it. With its capture, the Russians have been able to use this as a springboard to continue advancing south through the tree line. The Ukrainians are now basically fell back to this tree line here, and this tree line, and basically in the vicinity of Bogdanovka here. And the Russians need to basically just take these forest lines out. So, the Ukrainians have retreated to the village of Bogdanovka, so the Battle of Bogdanovka is beginning. And that happened because they took the nursery. They've also managed to, let's talk a little bit more. So as I mentioned last week, they managed to capture the village of Kromova here in a daring offensive operation. After the capture of Kromova this week, they managed to actually advance north. They managed to capture this tree line right here. You could actually see some of the defense nodes that were established here during the Battle of Bakhmut. So this was taken by the Russians. This area here. Some other sources are saying that the car racing track right here has also been taken by the Russians. So beyond that, by the end of the week, so one thing you have to notice about this area, I don't think this area has been updated with the map. The map here has some areas that have been updated and some not, but so you can't, like you could see in Klishchiivka, it's been updated. You can see the trench line because it's the dominant height in that area, right? You can see the this. Well, imagine this, but let me show you. In this area, so along the road here, a little bit to the east of the graveyard, in this area is the height in this area for the southern part of Bogdanovka. If the Russians are able to capture this, and actually it starts around here, and there is geolocated footage by the end of the week of Russian assault troopers taking the first trench networks of this fortification in this height. And so if this continues and the Russians are continuously are able to occupy this height here, so if they're able to do that, then they basically, it's kind of the same thing that's happening in Klishchiivka. They could use this height to continue their advancements to, along this area here to reach the north of Ivanivska, and basically collapse Ukrainian defenses that are along these tree lines. And the thing is that as they go up, this goes higher and higher. Now, it's not a big height difference, but you know, as the Ukrainians are as they defend are on the heights. This is actually why Wagner was not able to break through here, because right now the Russians are pretty much where Wagner was in May, but with the difference being, and the reason why Wagner was not able to advance, because once they reached here, they began the assault for Bakhmut itself, because they basically just had this highway under fire control and this road under fire control, and so they didn't actually need to continue advancing here, and so when that happened, the reason why they weren't able to continue advancing is because of the dominant height here. There's also another dominant, not dominant height, but another height fortification in this forest here to the west of Bogdanovka, which the Russians also have to take. And so you could see, so they have to take this area, they have to take this area, and when they take the heights, which again is hard, the Wagners weren't able to do it, but they're able to take it, then they'll be able to take Bogdanovka in pincers. The defense of Bogdanovka will collapse. The Russians will then swoop down here and probably try to take these two forest lines here. They might just take Grigorivka just to secure their flank here, and again, it makes them go along the canal, so they might just take this area here. From this area, they'll go south and attack Ivaniska from the north, and so basically reach the canal. The only big thing is that right in front of Chasiv Yar is this very strong fortification with all these high-rise buildings here, and there's a very thick forest in front of it, and so maybe this will be like the last Ukrainian kind of small bridgehead on the canal. But in the north here, the Russians will push here and take Grigorivka, maybe Kalinia. And then here, the Russians will be in front of this area, but then they'll attack Ivanivska from three sides, collapse it, and force the Ukrainians to get back to the canal. Again, these two operations in the south, trying to take Klishevka and Andriivka, and then here to take Bogdanovka and the surrounding heights and hills around it, are linked, because the goal is to link up in Ivanivska, storm this area from three sides, and then reach the canal. And this is basically one of the biggest news because this is another offensive operation rivaling Avdiivka, because that's another offensive operation the Russians have undertaken, and now we understand that Bakhmut is another area the Russians are attacking. So that's Bakhmut. So we could talk about the offensive of Bakhmut, because now it's no longer just the Russians are just going a bit slow here. Maybe they exploit an opportunity. They are now on a full-on offensive mode, and we'll see how the progress continues next week. On this front, on the Seversk front, there's been some changes here as well. The Russians managed to recapture some lands that they lost during the Ukrainian counteroffensive here. The Ukrainians were trying to storm Soledar, but that failed. So they regained this area right here, and basically are now wedged. They got closer to Rezdolovka and to the west of Visola. Along with us, the Russians are continuously moving up along this tree line here. Along this rail line. And they're right now battling for this kind of tree line here. Now, these two pincers basically threatened to cut off Ukrainian forces in Visola, in an encirclement. The goal is basically to compromise the situation and force the Ukrainian, because then there's just a bunch of fields here. It's very hard to defend themselves here. So basically complicate Ukrainian defenses in the south of Seversk. We'll see if the Russians can continue their progress here, but again, after the fall of Soledar, the flat line here kind of solidified, and the front line's been kind of the same for almost a year, for a lot of months. But as you can see, there's a lot of trenches here. There's you can see the trenches to the north of this village, And so this is not, it's not like, oh, it's just flat fields. There's a lot of Ukrainian defenses in these fields, a lot of minefields as well. And so, taking this village is not really of, it's just a bit, my guess is that the Russians want to basically make a new position along this river here, the Suvka Poltava River, just to make a better defensive point. However, I think this is also more on the height, and so the Russians don't want to just take these villages. They probably want to take maybe the heights in front of them as well. So maybe these areas here along these tree lines. So the Russians are on pushing here, and we'll see if they can continue developing the situation to the south of Servisk more, and see if they could finally take the village of Visola. So that's been big changes here. Let's go to the tradition, what we've been talking about for like 2 months now. 2 months now. This is, I think, the second month anniversary of the Russian offensive in Avdiivka. The main thing to talk about is the village of Stepova, which has been kind of the main focal point for about a month now. The thing about this is that, so the Russians have this place is basically, this village is a no man's land. Ukrainians don't occupy it solidly. The Russians don't have a firm occupation there. The Ukrainians are in Berdichi. They have a good position here, and the Russians are along this rail line. Those are the solidified positions, and then Stepova is kind of this no man's land. The Russians have positions to the south in these tree lines here. They have positions in the eastern part of the village. They also have some positions to the north here. But again, these are tentative positions. They're holding. The Ukrainians would go from Berdichi, go on the attack, bomb Russian positions, and then retreat. The Russians would bomb those Bradleys and such. These, right now what the Russians are trying to do is withstand Ukrainian attacks to such an extent that they could then create a solid bridgehead. What does a solid bridgehead look like? Something like this. If you follow my mouse in Stepova, you could see they're trying to make a bridgehead on the western side of the rail line, because once they reached this rail line about a month ago, this was a good defense point. Now they want to go beyond it to continue the encirclement of Avdiivka, and that can't happen, and obviously the Ukrainians don't want that to happen, so they've been counterattacking, and obviously the bridgehead here is a lot less tenable because it's very hard to supply a bridgehead in anything. So that's what's happening in Stepova. It's a no man's land. The Russians have some positions. They are trying to secure those, solidify it, but we'll have to continue seeing if the Russians are able to create a bridgehead in Stepova. And so we'll have to continue watching that. The Russians are also, geolocated footage finally confirmed the Russians are in the southern part of Nova Kalinova, around the south of this lake here. And so, the Russians are, beyond this bridgehead, beyond this rail line as well. So it's going slow. Also in the northern part, there has been final we've talked about this before, but the Russians have control over this filtration plant and these dachas because of footage of the Ukrainian shelling these positions here. So there's still progress for the Russians are on the attack in the north, but it's very hard because they can't continue until they solidify their gains. And they're having some gains, but again, it's slow. And so until they have that bridgehead to continue having that like Stepova like a flower, where once they take this bridgehead, they could expand towards Berdichi, towards the south, towards this like kind of ravine here. And towards the north here, and create a bigger bubble. Like until they do that, it's gonna be very hard to, it's gonna be slow progress. So they have to just slowly solidify their gains here. In the south, it's not shown on this map, but on Rybar's map, which I don't have up, but Rybar has reported that the Donetsk filtration system right here has been taken by the Russians. We don't have total confirmation of that just yet from more other sources, but if that is true, according to pro-Russian and sources and Rybar himself, basically Ukrainian positions in this area, along with in this this village here, that's been kind of destroyed basically. So everything along this highway, like around here, and then to the Donetsk filtration system has been taken by the Russians. And if that's true, that means basically the Russians are now going to attack the residential area of Bakhmut from the east. So after they took the industrial zone, they were able to attack it from the south. But if the capture of the Donetsk filtration system is true, they'd be able to attack Avdiivka from the east, or the residential area. And so right now the clashes are going on for this forest here. And once the forest is clear, the Russians will be able to attack the residential area. And these like dachas near the lakes here as well. As I mentioned before, advancing from this fortified area towards here will also be able to cut off the rest of the pre-war strong points of the Ukrainians in Avdiivka, namely the Tsar's Hotel here, the Tsar's Hut, and the anti-aircraft military base here. If they could get behind here, they could cut off the defenses of these areas, which are preventing the Russians from, which are holding the Russians back in the south. So the Russians are still attacking in Avdiivka. They're making slow progress. The focus has been kind of moved to the south. So when the Russians advance in the north, the Ukrainians focus there, but then they, that neglects the south, and the Russians attack in the south, and then the Ukrainians pull troops here, and then when the Ukrainians pull troops to the south, they attack in the north. So they're trying to slowly encircle Avdiivka, put it in a trap, and it's going to take a while. I don't think Avdiivka is going to fall until about maybe February or March, but it's slow progress, but Russians are making progress, and we'll see how that develops next week. One thing to talk about Marinka is that, as I mentioned last week, the Russians managed to capture Marinka. A few things is that it's the technicality, but a few buildings, like I think, in here in the north here, I think like maybe in this, there's like a few Ukrainians still here. There's been Russians have planted their flags in these areas in the south, in this areas right here in Shakovska and Polorafrishkanika Street, these areas here, but not here. And so a lot of sources are saying there's some Ukrainians here still. But even so, if it's like, oh, they only control 3% of the village, right? Well, the strategic gain that the Russians gained from Marinka is basically have been established already, and it's more of like, as I mentioned, a morale thing to take Marinka. And so, just a little bit of clarification about the capture of Marinka from last week. They did, they basically took 100% of it, but if you want to be technical about it, they took maybe 95% of it. But, just a little bit of a clarification. Let us also go to I call this the Luhansk front. If we go to the north here, the battles, the Russian troops are in the, some sources say they're in the north of Simkovka. So, they're battling for the first houses in Simkovka, but that's like last week. And you might be wondering, like, why are the Russians, the Russians have been battling over this village for, like, a lot of months, so, like, what's going on? Well, the reason why the Ukrainians want to hold on to the Sinkovka village and the forest around it is because if that falls, then that opens the gates to beginning the Battle of Kupinsk in force, because once these forests in that village falls, the suburbs of Kupinsk and Kupinsk itself will be under attack, and the Ukrainians want to keep the Russians battling for these for the outskirts of it, not for the city itself. So the Russians are still, the Ukrainians are trying to stop the Russians from advancing in the forest. The Russians are trying to get a foothold in Sinkovka. So I just wanted to mention that. The Russians are also actually made an attack on the Liman direction. They managed to capture the, if you look here, I forgot, this was called like the gully here. I forgot the name of it, but this week the Russians managed to capture this ravine gully thing. And now, right here, and now the Russians are going to, the Ukrainians have these positions in Terny, Yampolovka, and this is the Ukrainian bridgehead. And as you can see, it's on the Zhirobets River, and the Russians are hoping to push the Ukrainians on the other side of the Zhirobets River. And but this front line's been static for a year, and thus it's very hard to, how do you say this? It's hard to, the Ukrainians have a solidified, very strong defense here, and so it's going to be hard for the Russians to push them back to the Oskol River. So the Russians are now pushing in the Luhansk direction, and not just in Kupinsk, but now towards Terny and Yampolovka. They managed to capture a ravine here, a strong point, but again, they have to continue advancing, and we'll see if they can continue building upon that progress. The Russians are also actually on the attack in the Zaporozhye direction, which is, this has been a back and forth. The Ukrainians would be on the attack, the Russians would counterattack, and so, the Ukrainians were on the attack here. This was the main area of Ukrainian advance in the summer, but after it turned the fall, it was like the Ukrainians would attack, the Russians would attack, but now, in the winter, the Russians are basically on the attack. So this week, most of the fighting has been taking place near Robotyne. There's been geolocated footage that the Russians attacked and captured part of the southern defense trench line here in the south of Robotyne. The Ukrainians are still in the more eastern part of the southern part, but if the Russians manage to build upon their progress on capturing the western part of this trench line here, and capture this entire southern part, this will give them a good springboard to start trying to take back Robotyne itself. The Russians are also the Ukrainians in the last month took a few tree lines and trench lines to the west of Robotyne. So, again, slow progress, but it's as I mentioned like last week, but the Russians are now on the attack, and they managed to recapture a tree line or two on this direction. So the Ukrainians took a few tree lines, the Russians took a few back. And so they're trying to basically prevent the Ukrainians from trying to solidify this pocket. And this week, basically, the Russians are on the attack. The goal here is obviously to get rid of this entire pocket together and make the front line more flat again, and get rid of all the gains the Ukrainians gained for this week, or for the last summer, for the summer offensive. So, they're basically trying to, right now the focus has been around Robotyne, but because if they capture Robotyne, they could then try to basically make this area that the Ukrainians are in these tree lines and everything untenable, and just make them forced to get pushed back. So that's what's happening in Zaporozhye. The Russians are trying to liquidate this pocket. And in the Kherson front, just to say, there's no changes here, but in the village of Krinky, the Ukrainians are getting shelled and fabbed to death in this village. The Ukrainians and the Russians haven't made any progress here in the last few weeks. There's been some, except the Ukrainians have been trying to enter this forest. That's been the main goal of their operation. But they haven't been able to secure themselves in this forest yet. Now, one thing to say is that I think this is just a distraction operation. I think the Ukrainians are going to begin another assault, maybe on the Kinburn Spit, or maybe somewhere else along the Kherson front, because I think they hope that all Russian troops here are focused on Krinky, and then when the Ukrainians attack in another direction, it's going to be hard to resist them. So, I think the Ukrainians are still trying to attack in Kherson just to have one section of the front where they're on the attack. Except here, they're not even on the attack. They took Krinky, or at least maybe half of it, about 2 months ago, and now they're just stuck there getting bombed. So they're not advancing here, but they are forcing the Russians to try to kick them out here. So that's the end of this video. There's been, this war is, the winter is here. The Russians are now on the offensive, but again, when I say offensive, any offensive here is basically measured in maybe at best a few kilometers. And basically the whole point is to improve your strategic, tactical positioning here, so that you could have a better defense point. You could have, maybe a future. It could help you make a future operation to take another part. That's basically the nature of this war. The front lines are static. It is not static, but the front lines are as they are. And if you want to improve your position on one part of the front, you have to it's basically a focus on battle over a strong point that's been built, or a hill, like the dominant hill in the area, or and things like that. So that's the nature of this war. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed my commentary on it. And if you did, please like this video and share it around. And if you want to see more, and comment your thoughts. If you want to see more videos, if you want to help, see more videos of myself of like this, subscribe to my channel to see more videos similar to this one. And I hope you have a really awesome day. So aim high and wander on.